Welcome all our attendees to Global Compliance Panel's live webinar on recalls, removals, and market corrections in compliance with FDA and ISO requirements. My name is Ricardo, and I am going to be your host today. On behalf of the Global Compliance Panel team, I would like to thank you for being part of this event. Today's webinar will be presented by Mr. Jeff Kassoff. Jeff Kassoff, RAC, is the Director of Quality at Bind Medical, a leading manufacturer of endoscopy products. Among his responsibilities is management, compliance, and review of customer feedback. Prior to this, Jeff spent 13 years at LifeTech as the Director of Regulatory Affairs, where he was responsible for regulatory compliance of all aspects of quality systems. Jeff received his Regulatory Affairs certification in 1996. We are honored to have such a distinguished person such as Mr. Kassoff with us to present this webinar. Before we begin, I would just like to inform you of the program outlined for today's training session. This webinar is for 60 minutes duration. First, Jeff will take you through today's webinar, highlighting the areas that would be covered, and he would then share with you his presentation. We would also like to inform all our participants who have joined, once part of this teleconference, you have been placed on mute and will remain so until the Q&A window begins towards the end of the webinar. This is for the purpose of avoiding discontinuity and for allowing our presenter to speak clearly so that everyone present takes benefit from this webinar. We also request all to hold back your questions till the Q&A window begins. If any questions do come up during the webinar, do feel free to send me a chat message and we shall take care of them, or we shall pass them on to Jeff at the end towards the Q&A session. 10 or 15 minutes time have been allotted for the Q&A, during which your questions will be answered. If for any reason you do get logged out of this training session, do follow the same procedure to join back again. Now that we are all ready to start, I request Jeff to take it from you. Jeff?
Thank you very much for the introduction, Ricardo. Let me welcome everybody coming to this webinar. For those of you who have not attended webinars in the past, you'll find that the lack of requirement for you to travel far exceeds the only detriment, which is pretty much I can't see you and you can't see me. Therefore, at the end of my webinars, I always like to present the feedback as more of a Q&A session. If I respond to a question, you need clarification, just go ahead and ask it. If you have a specific application that your company has seen and you want to talk about that, that's fine too. Well, today's webinar, as it says, we're going to talk about recalls, removals, and market corrections. Now, these are the worst case scenarios. In these particular situations, you've noticed, or unfortunately in some cases you've been told by your customer, that there's something out there in the field outside of your control that has a problem. The best way to start in addressing any sort of regulatory issue, much less something as critical as recalls, removals, and market corrections, is to look at the regulations that apply to the areas. From an FDA perspective, Section 806 is actually titled Medical Devices, Reports of Corrections and Removals, and Section 7 is recalls. From an ISO perspective, the Medical Device Directive itself addresses these type of market situations in Article 10 and also in Annex 7, Section 4. And there's a guidance document put out there, 2.12-1, the current Rev is Rev 6, and it's titled Guidelines on a Medical Devices Vigilance System. Vigilance is the European Community's definition of what to do, how to handle it when you receive feedback from the field that is negative, that requires you to either correct or get back the product. What I do during my webinars is I will take certain sections of the regulations and put them in my explanations and my definitions. You didn't come here for me to read you the definitions. In many cases, neither will I actually read the slide verbatim. You'll be able to get the slides after the presentation from Compliance Panel, and you'll be able to read them later on yourself. But for those of you who are wanting to look at the specific regulations that apply, I like to include them at the beginning of my webinar. Before your evaluation of what action is necessary, you're going to receive feedback of some type of nonconformance. I've been told that this section of my presentation is a little complaint-based, but I feel like it's really important to remember that before you can begin to determine whether field action is required, you've got to make absolutely certain that you receive all feedback. If feedback is missed that should have led to determine a field action of any type, FDA or a notified body will issue severe sanctions against your company. In FDA situations, it could be something as serious as seizure, injunction. From an ISO perspective, I've anecdotally heard tell of revocation of ISO cert or CE mark. There are bad situations here. Remember, this feedback can come from any source, and what you want to do here is make sure, obviously, that you train your personnel on complaints. Now, this is any type of person who could receive feedback externally. You'd be surprised how often, myself as the director of quality here at Byrne, I've received phone calls from customers. A lot of times they'll call the receptionist or they'll call the main number, and during their search for someone who to tell about their product not working, oh, director of quality, that's who I want to talk to. If you have a receptionist, the receptionist could get this call. Anybody who is in a situation where some irate customer or some concerned end user may want to contact them should be trained on how to handle complaints, but not just on how to handle complaints, but also when it comes to field action determination. Because, of course, you're going to train all your company's employees who could receive complaints on what to do with that, on customer feedback, but you've got to also train them on the most significant use of that feedback data, use in determining whether field action is required, and also the possible repercussions should an incident be omitted from reporting. Scare tactics often work in a situation such as this. When it comes to determination of field action, the characteristics of the need for field action are what's going to push you in the direction of what type of field action to take. If you have a certain device and it's reported to be defective, and it could be a risk to health, that's going to be a recall. However, if it's been defective and a risk to health, it's going to be a recall also. So in one situation, it's defective, maybe it could be a risk to health, maybe not, recall. Defective and absolutely risk to health, recall also. If you determine that the use of the device will cause serious adverse health consequences, or death, obviously, or may cause temporary medically reversible adverse consequences, that's a recall. So in these two situations, nobody got hurt. You know, the device was defective, but it did not injure anybody. However, but if this happens again, and you know that the device will cause serious adverse health consequences, or even a lower level, think about the lower level here, that it may cause temporary medically reversible adverse health consequences. Those are all recall situations. As you can see, I have two phrases underlined here, risk to health and serious adverse health consequences. I'm going to define them later in this presentation because they're open to interpretation. There are many regulatory questions, regulatory definitions that are open to interpretation that are not defined in the regs. These two I'll help you define. When it comes to removal, though, what's going to happen with removal is you need to take that device and you need to remove it from its point of use to some other location. The location could be your distributor if you sell through a distributor, or it could be back to the place it's manufactured. Or in either situation, it's a removal for any of the following reasons. For repair, it's broken. Modification, you need to tweak it, change it a little. Adjustment, that's very similar. Adjustment's usually taken into consideration when it comes to equipment. Relabeling, if it's mislabeled, then you need to get it back. Destruction, because continued exposure could be a problem. Or inspection, you need to take a look at it again. Here are the definitions that I just promised. A risk to health, remember the previous slide talked about the device is reported to be defective and could be as risk to health or defective and a risk to health. A risk to health is a reasonable probability. Unfortunately, the term reasonable here is not defined. So when it comes to reasonable, I recommend you define it very conservatively. So risk to health is a reasonable probability that use of or exposure to this product is going to cause there's serious adverse health consequences. Again, death is easy to define, obviously. Or the same type of use or exposure may cause the temporary or medically reversible adverse health consequences, or some sort of outcome where the probability of this is remote. So now you've gotten to the point where it's going to cause medically reversible adverse health consequences, or even temporary adverse health consequences. Or the probability is remote, but there is a probability, however remote, that serious adverse health consequences can occur here. Excuse me. As I explained that you should define the word reasonable, the first word in definition 1, very conservatively. Similarly, in definition 2, the end of the first line there, may cause. You should define that equally conservatively. Here's your second definition when it comes to serious adverse health consequences. It is not defined anywhere in the recall regs, but what I've learned is that there's a similar place, and I want to let you guys know about this, where there is the term serious injury is defined in the MDR regs in CFR 803. And I like to use this here because when it comes to a phrase that's not defined anywhere in the regs, what I like to do is try to find a similar phrase that is defined in the regs. Serious injury, serious adverse health consequences, it's a good place to start. And in my experience, it's proven to be accepted by FDA inspectors. A serious injury is an injury or illness that is life-threatening or results in permanent impairment or permanent damage to a body structure, or requires medical or surgical intervention so that permanent impairment or damage does not happen. And the word permanent is further defined in the MDR regs as irreversible impairment or damage. Situation that comes to mind that I've dealt with in the past is a manufacturer of anesthesia needles makes needles that are only inserted into the tissue. And a situation occurred where the needle, during withdrawal of the needle edge fell off. Now, it was certainly easily retrievable by forceps. However, that does fall under this definition because that injury or illness did, definition 3, require medical or surgical intervention to preclude permanent impairment. If that needle stayed in the person, it was deep enough in the tissue that it couldn't just be pulled out by hand. So it required medical intervention. Medical intervention does not necessarily mean detailed surgery. It means any sort of medical intervention. Again, what I've advised you earlier, and I continue to do so, and will always do so, is to take these definitions as conservatively as possible. Similarly, let's say there's another company, and what they do is they make abdominal pressure catheters. And an abdominal pressure catheter has a balloon, a latex or a non-latex balloon at the end that is inserted rectally and it's filled up and it's used to measure internal bladder pressure. During removal, what sometimes happens is if that balloon is not deflated and is tried to be removed from the rectum, it may come off the catheter and sit in the rectum. Well, it's determined by that manufacturer, and has been determined by that manufacturer, that that does not constitute this definition, because according to clinical studies, it's shown that anything that's that close to the anus is going to be passed normally with the next bowel movement, for example. So it's not just, in many cases, it's not just, I'll speak very colloquially here, something is left in a person, in the patient, but where is it left in the person, and can it normally come out? In some situations, it requires medical intervention. The question you want to ask yourself here is, does a doctor or medical professional need to be involved to remove this? If they do, then it does constitute a serious adverse health consequence. So other definitions that I do want to start with here. A recall is a removal or correction, and you'll see market withdrawal down here. In both situations, there's a device that is distributed that is outside the scope of your control, immediate control. If you send it to one of your distributors and you need it back, that distributor is not your immediate control. In many cases, distributors, in most cases actually, a distributor is in another company that may or may not be distributors for quite a few different medical device manufacturers. If you need something back from your distributor, that is considered removal or correction. The distinction between a recall and a market withdrawal is a recall is the product that goes out is in serious violation of the law, and you know that the FDA would initiate legal action if it goes out there, if there's a potential for serious injury, for example. A market withdrawal is a step down. And what happens here is this is a product that involves a minor violation of the law. I'll talk about that a little more, the phrase minor violation of the law. That wouldn't be subject to legal action by FDA, or maybe no violation of law. You sent a product out to a customer and they got it, and you need to get it back because you sent them the wrong product. That could be considered a market withdrawal. In many cases, it's not. But what I'm saying here is that there is no violation of the law in that particular situation. Well, as you see here, each recall and market withdrawal has the phrase removal or correction. So therefore, we need to understand what the distinction between removal and correction is. A removal is the physical removal. I hate to define a word by using itself in its definition, but a removal is when you take something physically from its point of use and you move it somewhere else. A correction is fixing something without its physical removal from its point of use. When it comes to correction, what you're looking at is that you need to make the determination here. Does the product problem require removal to improve performance of quality of the particular device? And at that point, that's entirely up to you. Because remember, you can have, going back here, you can have a removal or correction that is not a recall, that is merely a market withdrawal. Or you could have a removal or correction that does constitute a recall. So what you do with the device, whether you get it back or fix it while it's in the field, does not impact whether it's a recall or market withdrawal. It's what is the problem that constitutes whether a particular event is a recall or market withdrawal. I do want to have a few words here on market withdrawal. As you recall, a full-scale, I'll call it product recall, seeks to remove all hazardous products from distribution. There's a problem here. There's a hazard, and we, as the medical device manufacturer, want to get them all back. In a market withdrawal, we're voluntarily removing the product because it has at best a minor violation. For example, improper labeling or improper packaging. We get a call from a customer, and they say that, yeah, part number 1000 is labeled as part number 100. Perhaps you have model numbers that are that similar. You can do a market withdrawal there. That's a voluntary removal on your part. There's a very, certainly you're in violation of the regs there because the product is not accurately labeled, but that's a minor violation. When it comes to product included, that's usually the result of a minor quality infraction. That doesn't include the product to be adulterated or misbranded. So what you're seeing here is, although this product is mislabeled here, it is not adulterated or misbranded. And what you need, and to finish talking about a market withdrawal, while there still is possibly a safety concern, further on down the road, perhaps the mislabeled product might be used in a situation where it shouldn't be. So it's possible that there ends up being an ultimate safety concern. There is no immediate safety threat right now. And that's where the definition, that's where your market withdrawal is distinguished here. Talking about recall. Every recall is classified, and the classification is issued by FDA. Class 1 is a reasonable chance that what's going on will cause serious adverse health consequences or death. And what's required to happen here is that you're required to notify your customers and direct them to notify the intended recipients. The phrase intended recipients it usually means situations where a customer could be an end user, or it could be a distributor. Your distributor is your customer. If you have a recall, you've got to notify your distributor to notify their customers. The ultimate responsibility is yours as the manufacturer of that device. It has your name on it, and you're required that the recall be conducted accurately and within, legally. So when you have a distributor, your responsibility does not end when it comes to notifying them. Yeah, distributor here in France, let's say, we have this recall, please notify your customers. What you want to do in this situation is to have them let you know who they've sold to. And in many cases, in some cases, let's back off a little here. In some cases, your distributor may not want to tell you who their customers are because they might be concerned that you would sell directly to those end users. And that's okay. They don't need to tell you, much like when it comes to HIPAA, patient privacy, they're not required to tell you, your French distributor is not required to tell you each of the names of doctors he sold to in Paris by name, for example, just to choose a city, just that, he can misname them. He can say, I've sold to 60 different customers. Here's a chart of 1 through 60. Here's how many products I've sold them, and here's how I've contacted them to get the product returned. So that's acceptable there. I just want you to remember that the ultimate and the user is the one that has to be notified of the recall. If you sell an off-the-shelf device, you've got to issue a press release to the notified public, to notify the public, and what's going to happen here is the FDA will work with you to craft that press release. I've heard tell of companies who are, over-the-counter OTC devices, I should say OTC, by the way, and what they've done is they have issued their own press release and gotten it out there in public, while FDA has followed it up with FDA's own press release, which in many cases leads the public to wonder why the FDA had to issue a public press release after the company did. Is there something wrong with the company's press release? I recommend that if you supply an over-the-counter device and you have a recall, you notify FDA and you work with them so that there is one press release issued. Like I just said, FDA is going to do what they want. They could issue their own press release. They could issue a public health notice. You want to work with them to try to minimize the perceived impact of your recall on the public. A Class 2 recall is a little lower recall, whereas in a Class 1, there was a reasonable chance that the device is going to cause serious adverse health consequences or death, to little less serious. Either the possibility is going to cause temporary or reversible health problems, or a remote chance it's going to cause serious health problems. So there's you don't have reasonable chance and serious health consequences married together. They're separated here. You're still required to notify your customers and to direct them to notify the intended recipients. Again, remember my distributor caveat. Press release, not required. The FDA is not going to issue one. You don't need to issue one either. Class 3 is the lowest recall classification. In this case, there's little chance that using this device is going to cause any health problems. Now, when you notify FDA that you're going to do a recall and they classify it as a Class 3, you still have to notify your customers. And also, if you have distributors, let them, you need to get their customers also. And again, there's going to be no press release here. The press release is reserved for a reasonable chance that people are going to die or be horribly sick. I've always referred to the group about which I'm going to speak as the recall committee, although there's often some chance that a recall is not going to be required and that the situation at hand could be limited to market withdrawal or a lower level correction or removal. It's just easier that way. I find in my experience that when you have a recall committee meeting, everybody's coming because they know that there's some sort of market thing that has to happen. If you call it a product removal, I can't even imagine a possible name that you would want to call it other than a recall committee, because this is when you get people there, you get them moving, and you get them attending meetings. There are enough people who should attend quality and regulatory related meetings who don't, that you need them. This is a meeting you need them to attend. The recall committee is going to meet on an as-needed basis when there's an issue that requires them to meet and determine whether it's a recall, market correction, or something lower. But the FDA is going to expect you to, on a regular frequency, quantify how many recalls you have. Many companies have management meetings that meet weekly or monthly. That's fine. In the management meeting minutes, you can just put on this date, the previous month, let's say for right now, January, December 2010, no recalls. So you can continue to do that. Many companies I know have actually done this in the past. What they will do is they will have a log specifically for the FDA to look at. Because if you put it on your management meeting minutes, those of you who have interacted with the FDA know that if you give them a piece of paper, they're going to read it. And even if you say to them, well, here's our management meeting minutes, but as you can see here, item 1 says no recalls in December 2010. It's a piece of paper. They're not going to stop reading it. You can't, it's not good practice to hand FDA a piece of paper and then pull it away from them once they've read what you wanted to read. To correct that, like I said, companies have prepared MDR/recall logs, I've seen them called. And it updates both MDRs and recalls on a monthly basis. December 2010, no MDR, no recall, initialed by the president of the company. There you go. But when you have to meet, the recall committee should meet immediately after the awareness for any sort of correction or removal. Define that in your SOP, train top senior management on this requirement, and meet immediately. If the president of your company is off somewhere in Australia presenting a paper somewhere, don't wait for him or her. Meet immediately, because you've got to take care of this in a timely manner. Your SOP is going to define who calls the meeting and the required attendees for the meeting. Make sure you let yourself have a few outs, such as here's the people who need to attend at a minimum. And then after the meeting, this is the requirement, let's say, for example, after which the president must be informed of the recall. What that does is it lowers your requirements for attendees, but includes the requirement of notification. The minutes of the recall meeting will document the conclusions. And you're going to ask yourself a couple of questions here. You're going to ask yourself, does this correction removal need to be reported to regulatory agencies? We'll take a look at the reporting criteria. Also, does it constitute a market withdrawal or recall? You're going to get something back in this situation, or you're going to have it fixed in the field. What type of situation is involved here? Is it a market withdrawal or recall? Once or if you determine you have a recall, you've got to determine how you're going to handle this. A plan to handle this is required in advance of actually performing the recall. This is the planned course of action that you should take in conducting a recall. The first thing you want to look at is what the depth of your recall is. And what depth means in this case is just the level and distribution chain, how far you extend the recall. And it depends on the product's degree of hazard and the extent of its distribution. Do you go to the consumer or user level, or do you go to the retail level, or do you go to the wholesale level? That's entirely up to you. Any conclusion you reach in a situation, you're going to have to justify. It's always best to realize that the deeper the contact, the depth of the recall, the better. Then you're going to have a public warning. Again, this is reserved for the most urgent of situations. And you're going to use this in situations where any other means for preventing use of the product appear inadequate. And you're going to, the purpose of this is to alert the public that your product presents a serious health hazard. Like I said, the FDA is going to require that this be issued, in Class 1 recalls at least, in conjunction with the firm. And while it's not required for Class 2 or Class 3, I know several people who have worked at over-the-counter devices that are Class 2, that have Class 2 and 3 recalls that do issue public warnings, press releases, if you will. And not even from a regulatory perspective, one of the key issues of, RAQA is to make sure that you're in compliance, but also just good business practices. So there are things that are folded into the regulatory affairs quality assurance arena that aren't necessarily limited to compliance. This is a good example. You're not required, if you have a Class 2 or 3 recall, to issue a press release. However, if you're if you're the regulatory person or QA person at one of these companies, I don't know, over-the-counter company, and you have a Class 2 or 3 recall, you may want to seriously consider issuing a press release because it looks good from a publicity perspective, and the FDA may do it even though they're not going to be required to. Your recall strategy is going to specify what type of warning is needed, whether a public warning is needed, for example, and how it's going to issue. If you're an over-the-counter company, or even if you're not, you want to make sure you define in your recall strategy, are you going to issue the warning through national or local news media, or are you going to go through sort of a specialized media, maybe a professional or trade press, or just to the locations, physicians and hospitals, for example? Your recall strategy is also going to have to define the depth of your effectiveness checks, and we'll talk about that more in just a few minutes. When deciding whether to report, firms should consider a couple of factors. One of the factors is whether FDA has issued a warning letter on the problem in the past, or whether you've had it cited as an observation on your 483 in previous inspections. If the problem is kind of common, the FDA has used its discretion not to ask, then it's likely that you're going to be correct in categorizing it as a market withdrawal and not have to submit a report. When you report, the action is initiated to reduce a risk to health, and also if there was a violation of the regs that could possibly present a risk to health. If you don't report, make sure you document your justification. In some cases, the type of feedback you've received is pretty straightforward. Well, it doesn't take, even in that case, it doesn't take very long to justify it. A couple of sentences, but just make sure it's in there in the files. And you're going to perform a risk assessment. You're going to determine the potential health hazard in the event that the product malfunctions or fails. In many cases, you can refer to the risk assessment that was done during the design process for your device. In some cases, if you have an older device or you've just recently become FDA compliant or ISO certified, you may not have performed a risk assessment yet. However, this is the time when you're going to perform a risk assessment to determine what the potential health hazard is. Reporting is not required in two situations that I just wanted to include here to make sure I cover them. You don't need to report when the action that you took to improve the performance of the quality of the device doesn't reduce any risk to health. And also, like I said before, market withdrawals are not required to be reported. Here's something else I do want to include. If you sell an instrument, and you, as part of your good customer relations, you have maintenance periods, and in your labeling it states that this particular unit should be returned once a year for some regularly scheduled preventive maintenance. That is not required to be reported. That's a standard thing. Make sure that's the best way to cover yourself here is to make sure that that is documented in your user's manual, your IFUs, perhaps in a contract, a legal agreement that you have with one of your customers. any sort of calibration or things like that are covered under routine servicing, but things like repairs of an unexpected nature, replacement of parts earlier than their normal life expectancy, or something like that, that's not routine servicing. Stock recoveries is when there's a device and it's been corrected. Notice how I use that in quotation marks. That is not the legal definition. But there's a device that hasn't been marketed and hasn't left your direct control. Let's say that your company does not use distributors, but you have your own company employees throughout the U.S. and possibly throughout the world that you stock devices at. And that way it's easier when they have a local customer who orders it. It doesn't have to come from the factory. It can come from a nearby place. Cuts down shipment time. If you find out that there's a device that has to be located there, that's considered your direct control. So in that particular situation, reporting is not required from the FDA. And actions prompted by the receipt of an MDR, a medical device reportable event, is its own animal, and that is not required to be reported to FDA because you have already reported it. What I mean by report not required in this particular situation is that if there's a recall that results from an MDR, that's already going to be covered and interacted with FDA under that previous product. You don't need to involve the FDA once again. The correction or removal process is one I definitely need to cover here in this webinar. The first step is to submit a written report to the recall coordinator of your local FDA office of any correction or removal if you had your devices fixed in the field, correction, or you pulled them out of the field, removal, if that action was initiated either to reduce the risk to health or to remedy a violation of the GMP regs that may present a risk to health. In those situations, you've got to submit a written report to the local FDA office. Now, this report does not in any way conclude that you're not admitting here that your device caused or contributed to this death or serious injury or there's something like that occurred. So I just wanted to point that out. What has to be in the report? There are certain requirements of the report, and I've included them here. The first thing you have to do is number your report. And you're going to follow the numbering system is your company's FDA registration number, followed by a date, sequence number, and report type, whether it's a correction or removal. Here's an example that on January 1st of this year, it would be, the X's are your registration number, and then here's the sample of that. The report has to have your company's name and address and phone number and who your contact point is there. Obviously, the correction or removal is not conducted by one person, but it's less responsible for conducting and more responsible for assuring that the correction or removal occurs. What the product is that is the subject of this correction or removal, classification, common or usual name, intended use, and the marketing status. Is it a 510K number? I still like to include the possibility that something is a pre-amendments device. These days, with the pre-amendments having been, close to 40 years ago at this point, that's not going to happen that often, but it is permissible that you have it is physically possible that there's pre-amendment devices still out there. So if that's the case, then you can include that, or a 510K number, and also your listing number. Further device information has to be included. The model number, description, any lot or serial number or numbers, or any type of specific identification which states the limitation of your correction or removal. What the event was, what did you hear from the field that gave rise to this information? And the actions that have already been taken, and the actions that are expected to be taken. I can definitely tell you that the FDA loves to see a timely report containing actions that have already been taken. notification of customers, stoppment of shipments, something to that effect. Anything you've heard, the next thing is anything you've heard from the field. Has anybody gotten sick? Has anybody gotten hurt when they're using this device? And how many were shipped under this correction or removal? And how many were in the same batch or lot that were subject to this correction or removal? Also, what they want you to do here is they want to start you to limit the extent of your recall. What was the date of manufacture and expiration date or expected life of the devices that are the subject of this? Who'd you send it to? And how many did you send it to? A consignee is just your customer, who you sent it to. Again, it's your customer, so a foreign consignee can be your distributor. So they want to know how many you sent to that particular distributor and when you sent it. They want a copy of all communications that you send. In many cases, I think maybe in all cases, I can think of at least, FDA is going to require that you prepare a letter which explains the need for the correction or removal and why the correction or removal is being implemented. And also, what I like to include in these letters when I customize them, because it's not just a dear customer, the way I make sure I get product back if I need to is by doing a mail margin, making sure that each letter has the customer's facility name and a person's name on it. That's going to make you more likely to get the items back. This letter is going to have to be included in your report to FDA. If any of this is unavailable, which it's certainly not outside the realm of possibility, especially if you report immediately, even before you've begun to, even before you've sent the letter out to your customers. So if something's unavailable at this point, why is it unavailable and when you're going to get it to them? The deadline for issuing the report is 10 working days. So as I said, you can have 9 working days of initiating the correction removal under your belt so that you can actually show FDA, you know what, we're telling you now, but we've already started, because the FDA is going to weigh, well, what's more important to your company, informing them or getting the correction removal started? The answer better be getting the correction removal started. There's a reason that the FDA gives you 10 working days to report to them, because they want you to start immediately. They want you to meet once you've done that, once you had the information. They want you to determine the extent of the correction or removal. They want you to do a lot of things. And also in the correction removal report is how long you're going to keep the information that you get back from this correction or removal. I recommend 3 years beyond the expected life of the device. Even if you don't manufacture the device anymore, you should keep your recall or correction, removal or correction documentation. After submission report, what may happen, and I'm sure you've definitely heard of it, is there's been a correction or removal, and the firm determined that, wow, initially we only knew that the correction or removal was limited to these 2 lots, but we found out that there's 3 more out there. That's why there's that's why it's allowable for there to be an amendment to the report. So after you've sent FDA everything, and you determine that you've got to extend that correction removal, that's when you send the amendment. And again, here's your 10 working days again. So start doing that. Start extending that correction removal. Start getting, sending the information out, getting their product back, but let FDA know within 10 days. Make sure on your amendment you cite the original report number, because that way FDA can link them together. And it's got to include new and additional information. Don't just send it to let them know that how you're doing, but you've got to include new and additional information. When it comes to your firm determining that you do not need to submit a report to FDA, you'll see here that these are the same records that you've got to maintain that you do have to report, except for one part, the 1, 2, 3, 4, the seventh bullet point down. is the justification for not reporting to FDA. And what I would tell you to do here is this has to be reviewed by a designated person. If you make this determination, this is a great opportunity, and I'm not a regulatory or quality consultant, so I'm not shopping or selling anything here. But in the past, I've used the services of a professional consultant to evidence my justification for not reporting a particular correction or removal to FDA. And that's a good way to do that. The FDA always tries to avoid conflicts of interest. Think about internal auditing. You can't internal audit an area that for which you have direct responsibility. Similarly, although it's not absolutely required, I'm wholeheartedly advising you to get your justification for not reporting reviewed by a designated person who is outside your company and has no conflict of interest. I mean, sure, well, you know what, you're going to pay the consultant, so maybe he or she has a conflict of interest there, but that's not the case. The FDA does not look at it that way. So as you can see here, the product information, its intended use, any sort of lot or serial identification, the events that occurred, what action has been taken, any copies of communications, all those items are in your report that you maintain that is not sent to the FDA. The only difference is one is sent to them, one is not. What's going to happen is you're going to start your recall, and you're going to have you could possibly have many companies or customers to which you've sent product. In these situations, you're going to submit recall status reports to FDA. You're also going to document them in-house because remember, you've got to keep everything in-house that you have to send to FDA if you determine that it's not reportable. Addressing right now periodic recall status reports, you're going to send them to district office. How often? It's going to be up to you. I recommend every 2 to 4 weeks or so. The FDA may or may not specify it. You or the FDA, whoever specifies it, is going to determine it by how urgent the recall is. And what you do pretty much here is when you hear from customers that they've either destroyed or returned recalled product, that's when you're going to submit your updates. So you're going to have a chart of the 132 customers who you sent contacts to, and on each line you're going to have how many products that you sold them and how many they used or discarded. When you send a notification to the customer, make sure you contain 2 blocks for them to just easily fill out. One is it might be a checkbox of everything's been used or thrown away. The other might be, here's how many we have in stock, 11. We're sending them all back to you, or something to that effect. That way you've covered everything. And you can discontinue recall status reports when you get something from FDA that the recall is terminated. You will receive a notification from the FDA. As I said, I do want to cover it a little here. What's in the recall status reports? It's how many customers you notified, the date and the method, how many responded to the recall communication, and how many products they had when they responded to you. You may have shipped them 16 last year, but they only have 4 now. Make sure that you help them fill that out. There are going to be customers who you're going to receive the letter back, no addressee known. They may never respond to you. That's fine, but you need to let the FDA know how many customers did not respond. They may ask who they are, but you're only responsible at this point for letting them know that they did not respond. This is all about quantity here. The FDA wants you to show them that every piece you shipped has been taken care of as part of your recall. And each recall status report must contain the estimated time frame for when you're going to finish this recall, when you expect this recall to be done. When it comes to the effectiveness check also, what you want to do is you want to make sure that all the customers have been notified about the recall and that they've taken appropriate action. You can go there, call them, email, however you do it. Years ago, there was something available for the FDA, sort of an assistance document, not even a guidance document, called Methods for Conducting Recall Effectiveness Checks. I have to admit that I'm not aware as of this moment whether it's still available online, but it was, and it was really helpful. the FDA will definitely assist you, which is why when it comes to effectiveness check, if you don't hear from a customer, whereas earlier I told you that the identity of the non-responsive customers may be requested by FDA, on your spreadsheet, feel free to list all the customers by name. And that way the FDA will see that this particular customer has not responded to you. The effectiveness check specifies the methods to be used for and the level, the effectiveness level. Are you going to actually contact, do effectiveness checks for 100% of your customers, or some percentage, determine on a case-by-case basis? As you can see here, there's various levels. You have to defend whatever level you choose. Most companies I know for that reason choose 100% of the customers, but if you work at a gigantic company and the extent of the recall is multiples of millions of products, that's when you may want to have your effectiveness check be actually a lower quantity than that. Vigilance is the ISO, the CE, the Medical Device Directive implication here. And in these particular situations, you've got to report the incident to the notified body. Here I've given you a website that contains a list of, competent authority, not notified body. This website contains a list of the competent authorities. The country you're going to use is the one that your EU, it's the one in which your EU representative is located. The format of the report, this is great. Annex 3 contains a form. All you do is just fill it in. I really wish FDA was this helpful. I mean, FDA gives you a format to use, which is good, but there's actually a form here in the MedDev document. When it comes to reporting timeframes, serious public health threat immediately, but no later than 2 days after you become aware. When it comes to death, immediately after you establish a link between your device and the death, but no later than 10 days, and all the others. Immediately after the link is established, but not later than 30 days. I like that it says immediately, but no later than. So as far as I'm concerned, the requirement is where it says no later than. Days here, these are calendar days. When it comes to reportable incident from an EU perspective, a reportable incident has to meet all three of these. So the question is, what type of incident is considered reportable in the European community? The device fails to perform, and this is just sort of a malfunction or deterioration in the characteristics of the performance. Any false positive or negative reading that falls outside the performance specs, any unanticipated adverse reaction, any unanticipated interaction with any other substance or product, degradation or destruction of the device. It means more destruction really than degradation. Obviously, it's going to be unanticipated, not obviously caused by something else. You have an electronic device that bursts into flame, for example. Inappropriate therapy, this is off-label use. And inaccuracy in labeling, any sort of labeling, IFUs, promotional materials, something like that. The second criteria that a reportable incident must meet, again, something in here and something in here, is your device is suspected to be a contributory cause of an incident. And when you look at the link, what you want to consider is the opinions of healthcare professionals. That's going to be maybe the end user of your device, or if you have like a friend of your company. Many people have cronies. That's not really what I mean, but healthcare professionals who are intimately involved with their device, perhaps on the board of directors. The results of your assessment of the incident and any sort of previous similar incidents you've had, they will help you assess the link. If it's unclear, the European community is going to assume that your device did contribute. But I want you to err on the side of caution here. If you can't get a healthcare professional and your preliminary assessment is sort of vague or inconclusive, and you have evidence of previous or similar incidents, I definitely think you meet the criteria for number 2. And the third thing here is the event led or might have led to one of the following outcomes. Death, not just of a patient user. I like the directive says, or other person. I don't know what that means, but anybody who dies, you meet, if the event led, that's what happened. Serious deterioration, is, as you can see here, is any of the following. It's a life-threatening illness, permanent impairment, or permanent damage, any sort of condition that requires medical intervention to prevent either of the above. You can see there's a great deal of similarity, if not identicalness, between the vigilance reg and the FDA regs. Any indirect harm, so any harm at all, and fetal distress. It interests me quite a bit that there's any sort of child, baby or fetus-related nonconformance here. So for a reportable incident, you've got to meet, from a vigilance perspective, you've got to meet all three of these. So I think what I'll do is I'd like to have a couple of hypotheticals to close out. The first one, and like I said, I normally like to read, but I'm going to read here. One of the modules in Optex's new software program used to interpret the results of a blood gas test is opened, and the screen freezes. This doesn't result in the software malfunctioning or incorrect results. It's just a nuisance. So in this case, Optex issues a software patch to the customers to correct the problem. So the question here is, what should Optex do? And the answer here is, this is not reportable. It's a correction, but it's not reportable. The software patch is obviously a correction, but Optex does not have to notify FDA. Of course, Optex is going to have to review its risk assessment documents and conclude that the fact that the screen froze does not create a risk to health. That's the key here. There was no risk to health, or potential even, risk to health created. Well, here's another hypothetical for Optex, right? Each time version 3.2 of the software program is opened, a malfunction causes a momentary delay in the initial cycle of the cardiac pump, which supports an intra-aortic balloon catheter. Well, the nurse who reported the event said, you know what, I'm reporting a complaint, but I don't see any effect to the patient. There's really no effect here. What should Optex do? Hopefully, you've not fallen into the trap here in which the nurse says, nothing happened, because the answer here is this is reportable, because there's going to be a correction with a software patch. But although the nurse stated that there does not appear to be any effect on the patient, cardiac pumps are life-sustaining devices. Because there was a malfunction and it caused an interruption in blood circulation, there is most definitely a risk to the patient here. So remember that a malfunction that occurs does not have to have caused death or serious injury, but if it occurs again, that could happen. In summary, first thing you want to do is determine the nature of the incident. Collect all your facts, every single fact, get as many facts as you can. Perform your failure investigation, and then classify your incident. You want to determine, is this reportable, yes or no? That's a key determinant here. Determine what actions you're going to take, and then take them. And the key thing here to all this is not a regulatory requirement. And what you want to do here, is make sure that everybody is informed constantly of what's going on. When it comes to any sort of correction or removal, especially if it's a recall, there is no such thing as too much information. Make sure that everybody internally knows about the status of this, from your shipping supervisor to obviously your president, and all of your external customers. Make sure customer service knows about this. Make sure that's an internal person, obviously. Make sure all of your distributors know about this so that everybody is well aware of what's going on. Thanks very much, and that's the end of the presentation. I'll send it back to Ricardo, and we'll take some questions.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for that wonderful presentation. Now we'll be ready to take all the questions that have come through. And just to let all our attendees know, we also have an option of asking a question directly. We could open up the lines. You would notice beside my name, there's a palm-like icon. Once you click on that icon, you could ask the questions directly or verbally to Jeff Kassoff. I could go ahead and unmute your lines. So far, we already have a couple of questions. Also,
I do.
Go ahead.
Yes, there's a written question. The question is, can you speak about international situations where you decide to recall a product in a non-U.S. market, which is also marketed in the U.S.? Do you need to notify FDA of this recall, even though the issue might be limited to a particular lot sold outside? So what I'm understanding here is that there's a recall in a non-U.S. market. Now, it would depend on the nature of the recall, because if the recall is a malfunction, remember, that could occur like in the second situation where the pump malfunctions. In that situation, if that occurs outside the U.S., it has occurred. There's a chance that even though no one has been injured, that malfunction, if it were to recur, could cause death or serious injury. In that particular situation, you would contact the U.S. FDA and let them know of your determination, because they would expect you to do a recall of this device. So if that answers that question.
Okay, Jeff, we have one more question here which came through the chat panel. I'll just go ahead and send that along.
Okay.
Did you get it?
I got it. Excuse me. The question is, why is a mislabeling issue, why is a mislabeling issue, why is it not considered a major violation to become a recall? That's a good question. It's difficult for me to speak to the intent of the FDA, but I can tell you that the labeling issues are very different. The circumstance I gave you when a model number was incorrect on a label is a minor violation. But if you're a company that sells two different types of devices that have two different intended uses, and that's mislabeling issue, that is considered a major violation. So I apologize for misleading you attendees, and if you interpreted that every mislabeling issue is not considered a major violation. The situation I gave you is not considered a major violation. However, if the intended use is wrong on the device, or you switch devices like that, that would be considered a major violation and require a correction or removal. So thank you very much to the questioner for pointing that out.
Thank you, Jeff. Jeff, we have another question here. I'll just send that also through the chat panel.
Okay. Here it is. For implantable medical devices, is losing the serial number information considered a major violation which requires a recall? That's a great question. I'm only going to speak anecdotally and not based on experience. Fortunately, all the medical devices I've ever been involved in from a personal or consulting basis have been non-implantable. However, it is a regulatory requirement that implantable devices maintain the ability to be serial numbered. So I'm going to take the worst possible case scenario here and say that this implantable medical device not just did not have the serial number on it, but the patient into whom it's been implanted, there's no more link between him or her and the device that's inside of them. That is considered a major violation and would require recall. That's a significant, again, how significant is the violation of law? Clearly a violation of law in this case. How significant is it? Well, if it malfunctions, what type of investigation can be performed? The answer is none. Therefore, not complying with the regular requirement that implantables be exclusively identified would require a correction or removal. Well, I guess not a correction, but a removal and hence a recall. So thank you for that question.
Thank you once again, Jeff. So far, we don't have any further questions, but we could give it another minute or so.
Sure.
Meanwhile, I'd just like to inform all our attendees I have opened the polling or the feedback form in the polling panel. The feedback form had just about 7 or 8 questions, mostly multiple choice in nature. And if you could take about 2 minutes of your time to fill that as well, we would greatly appreciate it. And we do value your feedback in order to improve our webinars further. If any questions do come along, this is your time to ask us. So we do have a little time left. So if anybody does have any questions, we are still willing to take any. Jeff is still here to answer any of them. Also, we have some upcoming webinars also, which Jeff is conducting on February the 1st. We have design history file, design device master records and device history record, and the technical file, the regulatory documents explained. So for further information, you could go to our site at www.globalcompliancepanel.com. We have also a list of past webinars from Jeff, which you can buy them in the recorded format which is available also on our website. Okay, Jeff, we don't seem to have any further questions coming along for today.
Okay.
With your permission, maybe we could close the session, and if any of our attendees do have any further questions, they could go ahead and send their questions over, and we could answer them via email.
Absolutely.
Great. Then with your permission, Jeff, may I conclude today's session?
Of course.
Thank you once again. I would just like to thank all our attendees for having taken part in this webinar. If you would like to get in touch with us, you can send us an email to our generic email, that's webinars@globalcompliancepanel.com, or you could send it to me at ricardo@globalcompliancepanel.com. If any of you feel that your team members, your colleagues, your friends might benefit from this webinar, we are happy to inform you that it will be available in the recorded format and can be purchased from our website, or you can call us at 1-800-447-9407. We do welcome your suggestions and feedback or ideas on how we can improve our webinars. If you would like to suggest a topic or desire a customized corporate training online or on-site, we ensure that whatever is your training necessity, it will be a priority. We look forward to having you with us again sometime soon and for your continued patronage. On behalf of our presenter, Mr. Jeff Gassoff, and the Global Compliance Panel team, I would like to say thank you for participating in this webinar, and we wish you a pleasant day ahead.